Star Trek is one of the most universally popular works of science fiction ever created. It's often cited as a landmark achievement in the genre, which pioneered many firsts for a TV show, both within the genre and in the broader TV landscape. However, for this video, I wanted to talk about the works which came before Star Trek. No fictional work is created in a vacuum, and even the most original creations were heavily inspired by films, books, and shows which already existed. So for this video, I wanted to run down the most prominent inspirations for Star Trek, the stories which Gene Roddenberry pulled from when he first conceived of the concept which became Star Trek. One of the oldest inspirations for Star Trek doesn't come from science fiction at all, but instead from historical fiction in C.S. Forester's Horatio Hornblower books. Roddenberry was an avid fan of the book series and envisioned Captains Pike, Kirk, and Picard with the character of Hornblower in mind. Someone who shouldered the burden of command, feeling the weight of responsibility for the lives of those on his ship, but also had a genuine love of exploration, discovery, and life at sea, or in Star Trek's case, life in space. While the characterization of Pike and Kirk was also heavily influenced by the macho cowboy heroes of the day, Captain Picard is probably the most akin to Hornblower, with Roddenberry in fact handing Patrick Stewart a stack of books when he was cast in The Next Generation. Personally, I have to hold my hands up and say I haven't had time to read much of these books, but friend of the channel Daniel Orrit from Space Dock is a big fan, and he also turned me on to the excellent 1998 TV series adaptation. It's a little creaky, but for what is no doubt a very modestly budgeted British show, the production values are actually quite impressive. A lot of the miniature work in particular really holds up. I can't attest to how faithful the show is to the books, but from where I sit, the writing is certainly to a high caliber. Iwan Grufford, it's a Welsh name, isn't it, is a very capable leading man in the title role, and he's complemented by some other recognisable faces, such as Paul McGann, David Warner, and a young Jamie Bamber. If you're a fan of things like Master and Commander or Sharp, then this series will be right up your alley. It's packed with memorable characters, thrilling action, and just solid traditional drama as Hornblower rises through the ranks of the Navy. It's kind of ironic Roddenberry hated Nicholas Meyer's take on Star Trek, because Meyer himself was also a huge fan of this book series, and consciously weaved in many Age of Sail motifs into his interpretation of Star Trek. Either way, if you like compelling characters with rich arcs and high seas adventure, or the planetary exploration and moral themes seen in Star Trek, give either the books or this series a go. A literature inspiration from the sci-fi genre for Roddenberry was E. Smith's The Skylark of Space, which is considered by many to be the very first work of the space opera subgenre. At first it begins as what was known as an Edisonade, a story about an inventor and their inventions, popular in the Victorian and Edwardian eras. The Skylark of Space follows Dick Seaton, who invents a space drive. When his bitter rival Mark Blackie Duquesne attempts to steal his invention, the resulting conflict sends Seaton, Duquesne, and a few others off on a space adventure. Eventually they become embroiled in a conflict on another world between two warring alien factions. The story was first published as a serial in Amazing Stories in 1928, before being revised and republished in novel form in 1946. Roddenberry, an avid reader of magazines like Amazing Stories from a young age, likely read the original serialized version as a young child. It's simplistic space adventure fun by today's standards, but it was incredibly influential. Author Frederick Pohl once said, "With the exception of the works of H.G. Wells, possibly those of Jules Verne, and almost no other writer, it has inspired more imitations and done more to change the nature of all the science fiction written after it than almost any other single work." The direct influence on Star Trek is much broader than something like Hornblower, but it no doubt fired up a young Roddenberry's imagination, and is something he definitely had in mind when he was creating the idea for Star Trek. Personally, I have a big soft spot for this kind of simplistic Dan Dare, Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon type sci-fi adventure story. Probably the biggest weakness of the book is the prose. It's just very creaky and awkwardly written, but the pace is exciting and the characters are very memorable. I've only read the first novel, but I've heard the literary quality does increase as the series goes on. But for now, I'd say The Skylark of Space is an enjoyable little romp, which I'd highly recommend to those curious to see how the space opera genre began. The more immediate sci-fi influence, though, is of course the landmark 1956 science fiction film Forbidden Planet. Set in the 23rd century, Forbidden Planet follows the crew of the United Planet starship C-57D as they journey to the planet Altair 4 to ascertain the fate of an expedition sent there 20 years prior. There they discover only two survivors, Dr. Edward Morbius and his daughter Altera. Morbius has made a home for himself there by harnessing the technology of the Krell, an extinct alien race who once occupied the planet, allowing him to create a home, supplies, and the wonderful Robbie the robot.
Nice climate you have here. High oxygen content.
I rarely use it myself, sir. It promotes rust.
The parallels to Star Trek are numerous and obvious. For one thing, it's set in a future with a united, peaceful Earth, in league with several other worlds, and follows a ship exploring the cosmos. The principal away team is made up of the ship's captain, first officer, and doctor, and their standard equipment includes a ray gun and communicator. The movie was pioneering in many aspects. The first all-electronic film score, the first sci-fi film set entirely on another planet, and the technical aspects of the production were cutting edge at the time. And this is where I'm going to piss off a bunch of people who love this film by saying I think it has aged catastrophically badly. Now don't get me wrong, the production design, visuals, and larger ideas are all great, but a huge chunk of the film's runtime is dedicated to a horrendously uncomfortable subplot about the ship's crew really wanting to bang Altera. And I'm really not kidding here, I checked this, it's only until halfway through the movie Dr. Mobius even reveals the existence of the Krell and all their advanced machinery inside the planet. And after this we get into some genuinely interesting thematic territory, but good God, the preceding 30 minutes are a slog. It's scene after scene of greasy looking men trying to get into this woman's pants, and after the captain tells them to get lost, he tells her it's her fault because of the way she's dressed.
Well, look at yourself. You see, you can't run around like that in front of men, particularly not a space wolf like Farman. So for Pete's sake, go home and put on something that'll, anything.
Which really makes their own contrived romance plot pretty uncomfortable. I know a bunch of folk are about to comment something like, that was just the attitude of the time, and yes, I fully understand that. Plenty of things I enjoy have dated elements, but it takes up such a huge part of Forbidden Planet, it ended up boring me more than anything else. That's not to say the movie is a total loss, not at all. When the movie gets over this terrible chapter, we finally get stuck into some solid science fiction. Dr. Morbius is a fascinating character whose own drive for knowledge inadvertently caused the deaths of the original expedition team, and the climax of the story touches that quintessential sci-fi narrative theme of humanity's hubris, and whether we're advanced enough as a people to handle huge technological leaps. I understand why Forbidden Planet is so iconic and has been so influential. I would invite viewers to seek out the film and judge for themselves, but in my opinion, other works have come along since which have far surpassed it. One of those works is indeed Star Trek. I hope you've enjoyed this little trip back in time to see what inspired Star Trek's creation. To be honest, I get a little irritated these days whenever I see clickbaity articles or incendiary comments accusing more modern sci-fi shows of quote-unquote ripping each other off and so on and so forth. Because the truth is, good artists borrow, great artists steal, and there's nothing new under the sun. Oftentimes what we think of as pioneering original works were really created by the authors of those works taking a bunch of things they really like and just sticking them into a blender. Even the works mentioned in this video are the same way. Hornblower takes after Master and Commander, Skylark is an Edisonade revamped with some Verne and Burroughs, and Forbidden Planet is Shakespeare's The Tempest through a ray gun gothic lens. Star Trek is another one of these works, Gene Roddenberry picking and choosing his favourite things to combine into an original work which has been added to by other creative minds and influenced by countless other pieces of science fiction since. One of the reasons I personally love Star Trek is that it almost functions as a distillation of so many of science fiction's best elements, but I would also invite any Trekkies or viewers who happen to stumble across this video to look into the genre a little deeper because you may be pleasantly surprised by what you find. Thank you for watching. If you like these videos, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on my new uploads. If you want to help the channel grow, join my patrons or my YouTube members, where you can see videos early as well as some other exclusive content. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.